He found me again, but loving him became more dangerous than leaving. Flashback, Jae-won's voice, low and rough. I spent 3 weeks dismantling half of Seoul, trying to find you. Amara's voice, if I stand beside you again, it's as someone you cannot afford to lose twice. Then silent. Part 2 begins. I woke up slowly. There was a moment, just one, where I forgot, where my mind hadn't caught up to everything that had happened, where I was just a woman on a couch in Lekki, listening to the sound of the water outside, and the world felt quiet. Then I opened my eyes, and I saw him, Kwon Jae-won, asleep in the armchair across from me, sunlight touching one side of his face, one arm folded loosely across his chest, his phone vibrating endlessly on the side table. Message after message, probably urgent, probably the kind of things that kept lesser men awake at night. He ignored all of it, even in his sleep. I used to think powerful men slept peacefully because they feared nothing. Then I met Kwon Jae-won and realized men like him only sleep deeply when they finally stop pretending to carry the world alone. That should have been my warning. Down arrow if you've not watched part 1 and go, and watch it now before proceeding with this part 2. And to those who watched it already, you know how we got here. Welcome back. Like this video, subscribe if you're new, and drop an emoji in the comments, so I know my part 1 people are here. Let's go. He woke up 20 minutes after I did. I know this because I didn't move. I just watched him, the way his eyes opened first, scanning the room before his mind fully arrived. It was a reflex, the reflex of a man who had slept in dangerous places for so long that even safety felt like a threat to be assessed. Then his eyes found me. Something in him settled, just for a second, just long enough for me to see it before he put the composure back on. You were watching me sleep, he said. His voice was still rough with exhaustion. You were sleeping in my living room, I said. It seemed relevant. He almost smiled. Almost. I got up and went to the kitchen. I knew he would follow. He did. I put the kettle on for bush tea, my mother's blend, the one I'd had shipped from Port Harcourt ever since I moved here. And he stood on the other side of the counter, watching me like he was memorizing something. Do you want tea? I'll make coffee. I don't have a coffee machine. He stared at me. What do you mean you don't have a coffee machine? I mean I drink tea. He looked genuinely unmoored by this information. Kwon Jae-won, the man who had navigated international syndicates and political assassinations without blinking, stood in my kitchen looking personally betrayed by the absence of an espresso maker. I handed him a mug of tea. He drank it without complaint. That told me more about where he was emotionally than anything he'd said the night before. We sat at the small kitchen table. The silence between us was different from what it used to be. Not the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill space, but the careful silence of two people relearning how to exist in the same room. I noticed things. The way his eyes moved to the door when a motorbike passed too close outside. The way he held his mug with both hands, not for warmth, but because stillness was something he had to consciously choose. The circles under his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. He noticed things too. I saw him clock it. The way I no longer automatically adjusted my schedule around the space he occupied. The way I refilled my own mug first without thinking about his. The way I had stopped performing comfort for him without realizing it. Good. Let him see it. Then his phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen, and something tightened across his face. How bad is it? I asked. He set the phone face down. The Northern distribution chain has had 3 failed handoffs in 6 weeks. 2 financial managers resigned without notice. The internal review committee is deadlocked on the Incheon expansion because no one can agree on risk assessment. He paused. And Park Soo-yeon's father has filed 2 regulatory complaints against our shell holdings in Singapore, which means the legal team is spending more time on defense than operations. I wrapped my hand around my mug. What you're describing, I said slowly, is not a management problem. He looked at me. No, he said. It's an absence problem. The words sat between us, and I understood what he was saying without him having to say it plainly. When I disappeared, Seoul didn't collapse. It just slowly forgot how to breathe. He put both hands flat on the table, a gesture I recognized. It was what he did when he was about to say something he'd already decided on, but was still choosing his words carefully. Come back with me. I was quiet. Not as my operations manager, he said. Not as staff. Not as someone who works for me. He held my gaze. As a partner. Equal authority. Your name on decisions that matter. Not behind me, beside me. I looked at this man, this complicated, controlled, occasionally terrifying man, sitting in my small Legos kitchen drinking tea he didn't want, asking me for something I could see it cost him everything to ask for. I did not say yes. Not yet. Because I had learned, the hard way, that the most dangerous thing I could do was want something before I understood its full cost. I took 4 days. 4 days of him in my flat, sleeping in that armchair, eating whatever I put in front of him, making exactly 0 complaints about anything, which was either personal growth or strategic patience. And with Jae-won, it was always both. On the 4th day, I sat across from him with a single sheet of paper. These are my conditions, I said. He took the paper. Read it. His expression didn't change. Independent authority over the divisions I rebuild. No override without mutual agreement. No decisions that affect my operational areas made without my direct input. No secrecy between us about internal threats. No emotional manipulation. And if at any point I decide to leave, you leave, he said. Cleaned at no interference. No consequences. I blinked. He had agreed to everything. Immediately. Without a single counter. That unnerved me more than resistance would have. You read the whole thing before I finished speaking, I said. I've been drafting this agreement in my head for 3 weeks, he said simply. I knew what you would need. I just didn't know if I was capable of offering it. A long pause. And now I know I'd rather give you everything than keep half of nothing. I looked at the paper. I looked at him. I said, give me until morning. In the morning, I packed 1 bag. We flew to Seoul. I had told myself the return would feel like going back. It didn't. It felt like arriving somewhere new inside a familiar city. The first meeting was on the same day we landed. No adjustment period. That was deliberate on my part. I wasn't going to give anyone the impression I needed time to find my footing. When I walked into that conference room, the shift was immediate. Before, I had moved through these spaces like furniture, present, functional, easy to overlook. Now, the room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of acknowledgement. The alert quiet of people recalibrating. 2 executives stood before they realized they were doing it. A lieutenant near the back straightened in his chair. Someone whispered something to the person beside them. I heard it. That's her. I sat down, opened my folder, and didn't acknowledge any of it. The first time I lived in Seoul, I survived quietly. The second time, people feared me before I spoke. Not everyone was pleased. I felt the resistance within the first week. Not openly. These were men too calculated for open hostility. But in the small things. Reports delivered late to my office. Information shared with Jae-won first, then reluctantly copied to me. A lieutenant named Beck who had been with Jae-won for 7 years, and looked at me like I was a problem that should have been solved already. The whisper circulating in certain rooms was that Jae-won had gone soft, that he had let a woman walk back in and handed her the keys, that the boss they feared was being managed by someone who had already proven she could dismantle him. Let them whisper. I've been underestimated my entire life. I knew exactly what to do with it. ACT 3. Loving him differently. 9 to 1300 hours. Here's the thing no one tells you about loving someone the second time around. It's quieter, and that makes it more dangerous. The first time, everything feels urgent. The pull, the tension, the electricity of 2 people circling each other and pretending they're not. The first time, love announces itself loudly enough that you can choose to ignore it if you really want to. The second time is different. The second time, it comes back in the details. It was the way he started leaving his second coffee of the day on my desk, without saying anything, the same way I used to do for him. Like he had studied the language I spoke, and was learning to speak it back. It was the late-night strategy sessions where we'd be working through a problem, and he'd suddenly stop and say, "What do you think?" Not as a formality, but genuinely waiting, genuinely wanting my answer before he formed his own. It was a Tuesday evening when I mentioned, offhandedly, not even really to him, that I missed the jollof rice from a specific place near my mother's house in Port Harcourt. I said it, and moved on to the next agenda point. 3 days later, there was a container of it on my desk. Flown in. Still warm. No note. I stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called him. "You had jollof rice flown in from Port Harcourt. You mentioned you missed it," he said. Jae-won, that's a logistical inconvenience. I'm aware. Was it still warm? I looked at the container. Yes, I said quietly. Good. He hung up. I sat with that rice, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had been holding tight for a very long time. The cruelest thing he ever did wasn't betraying me. It was changing after I stopped believing he could. But we still hadn't said anything. Nothing direct. Nothing named. We existed in this space between what we had been and what we were becoming. Close enough to feel the warmth, careful enough not to close the distance entirely. Partners professionally. Something unspoken personally. Dangerous exes pretending not to still belong to each other. I told myself the ambiguity was strategic. That I was protecting myself. I was lying. The truth was I was terrified that naming it would make it possible to lose again. Drop a comment. Are you Team Jae-won, or do you think Amara deserves something safer? I want to know. Like if this story has you hooked, and share it with your friend who loves a good mafia romance. There's more coming. Daniel Adebayo Park walked into my world on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after my return to Seoul. He was there for a legitimate investment meeting, the kind Jae-won had started hosting more frequently as the empire tried to build cleaner financial architecture on top of its murkier foundations. Half Korean, half Nigerian, with his father's soul polish and his mother's Lagos ease sitting in him simultaneously like two rivers that had found a way to share the same bed. He was not the most powerful man in the room, but he was the calmest. Most men in these meetings watched Jae-won constantly, reading him, adjusting to him, performing for him. Daniel watched the whole room, including me. After the meeting, while everyone else orbited Jae-won, Daniel crossed the room and stood beside me at the window. You spoke 4 times in that meeting, he said. Every time you did, the room shifted direction. I don't think most people in there noticed. I noticed, I said. He smiled. I know you did. That's more interesting. We ended up talking for 40 minutes after everyone else had left. Not about business. About Lagos versus Seoul. About what it cost to belong fully to neither place. About the particular exhaustion of being exceptional in rooms that would prefer you were merely adequate. He spoke to me like my power didn't intimidate him. That was rarer than it should have been. At some point he said, "You speak like someone always waiting for disaster." I looked at him. That's because disaster usually knows my address. He laughed. A real one. Not the performed chuckle of a man trying charm. Then he looked at me with something that was almost gentle. Maybe you need a different city. Something about that sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. Not because of Daniel specifically, but because of what it pointed at. The version of my life that existed somewhere outside blood and strategy, and the constant low hum of danger. I hadn't thought about that version in a long time. Jae-won saw us from across the room, that I know, because I felt it. That quality of attention that has texture, that lands on you differently from the ambient awareness of a crowded space. I didn't look at him. I kept talking to Daniel. But later, back in our shared office space, there was a stillness about Jae-won that I had never seen before. Not the stillness of control. The stillness of a man working very hard not to show something. He's clean, I said without looking up from my desk. His financials are legitimate. He could be a useful connection. Jae-won was quiet for 3 seconds too long. I know, he said. And in those 2 words I heard something I had genuinely never heard in Kwon Jae-won's voice before. Fear. Not of Daniel. Of losing me to a world that couldn't hurt me. The attacks started small enough that I almost missed them. A shipment I'd rerouted through a new partner. Flag at customs on information that shouldn't have been accessible to customs. A financial projection I'd shared internally, circulating outside the organization 3 days later in a competitor strategy briefing. A meeting location I had chosen and communicated only through internal channels. Compromised before we arrived. Every leak was surgical. Every leak hit something I had built specifically. I sat with that for a full day before I said anything. Running the pattern. Mapping the access points. Eliminating the variables. Then I walked into Jae-won's office and closed the door. We have a mole, I said. He didn't look surprised, which meant he'd already suspected. I know, he said. What I need you to understand, I continued, is that this isn't a general leak. Whoever it is, they are targeting me. Specifically, every compromised operation is something I built or rerouted or approved. He was very still. They're not trying to damage the empire, I said. They're trying to make you doubt me. The room was silent. Or, he said carefully, They're trying to damage the empire by removing you from it. We looked at each other. Both of us understood what that meant. They didn't fear Jae-won anymore. They feared what he became when I stood beside him. The external pressure wasn't helping. Park Soo-yeon's father, furious about the collapsed alliance, burning with the specific humiliation of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a woman he'd been told to disregard, had spent 2 months engineering financial retaliation, regulatory filings, frozen accounts, a coordinated campaign to create friction at every border we operated through. Meanwhile, inside, the loyalties that had quietly begun tilting toward me over the previous weeks were now creating a dangerous imbalance. Men who had answered to Jae-won alone for years were now waiting to see if I agreed before they moved. That was power. But it was also a liability, because it meant I had become a second center of gravity in a structure that had only ever had one. Lieutenant Beck, the one who had been watching me since day one, started holding his own private meetings. Nothing I could prove was insubordinate. Just quiet conversations in corners. Just the careful, patient work of a man building something he hadn't announced yet. I watched him. I said nothing. I documented everything. And one morning, very early, I pulled a file from the archive that I hadn't needed until now. I read it twice. Then I locked it in a drawer and told no one. Not yet. Daniel came back to Seoul 6 weeks after the first meeting. We had 3 professional conversations that week, legitimate, structured, appropriate. But at the end of the third one, when everyone else had gone and it was just the 2 of us reviewing a proposed partnership framework, he put down his pen and looked at me directly. "I want to offer you something," he said. "And I want to be clear that it's a professional offer. Whatever else you read into it, or don't, that's yours to decide." I set down my own pen. "I'm building a global logistics and investment network. Clean money. Legitimate infrastructure. Real political access in 4 continents. I need someone with operational intelligence, financial fluency, and the ability to move in rooms that most people can't get into." He paused. "I want that person to be you. Equal partnership. Full authority over your division. And Amara, it's legitimate. No blood. No danger. No midnight emergencies, and no one trying to dismantle your life, because they're afraid of how capable you are." I sat very still. "That's a significant offer," I said. "I know what I'm asking you to walk away from," he said simply. "I also know you're too smart to pretend that what you're walking in right now doesn't have a cost." I didn't answer him that evening, but I thought about it for 3 days. Honestly, really thought about it, and what scared me was how possible it felt. A version of my life where I woke up, and the first thing I did was not check for threats. A version where my skills were matched by the scale of my ambition without the constant undertow of violence beneath everything. A different city. Like he'd said. Jae-won found out on the 3rd day. I don't know how. I hadn't told him. But information was always his currency too, and I should have known that anyone watching me closely enough would eventually carry what they saw to his desk. He came to my office that night, after everyone had gone, closed the door, stood in the center of the room. The silence lasted long enough that I finally looked up. "Would you leave again?" he asked. His voice was perfectly controlled. His face was perfectly composed. But his hands were in his pockets, and I knew him well enough to know that meant he didn't trust himself not to show something with them. "You still ask that question?" I said quietly. "Like leaving you is easy." Something moved across his face. He crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair across from my desk. Not with authority, not with strategy. Just sat down, like a man who was tired of standing at a distance. "I don't know how to compete with someone who can offer you something clean," he said. "I've never had to. Everything I have costs something." "I know that," I said. "Then why are you still here?" I looked at him for a long moment. "Because you're the only person," I said, "who has ever made me feel fully seen." Pause. "And the most dangerous one I have ever loved." Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The truth just sat there between us, finally out in the open, too real to be strategic, too honest to be managed. And for once, neither of us tried to. It happened on a Thursday evening. A private syndicate negotiation. 6 people in a room, location chosen by me, communicated through what I had believed were secure channels. Jae-won to my left. 2 of his senior men across the table. 2 representatives from the Incheon network. We were 20 minutes in when the first car hit the outer gate. What followed was controlled chaos. That's the only way I can describe it. Because the people Jae-won surround himself with are trained for this. The table went over. Bodyguards materialized. Voices giving sharp instructions. But this attack was organized. Not opportunistic. Not desperate. Organized. They knew the entry points. They knew the number of guards. They knew which exit we would use. Someone had told them everything. I was moving toward the secondary exit when the second blast came from the wrong direction. I don't remember falling. I remember the floor, and a ringing that swallowed all other sound, and then Jae-won's face above me. And I had never, in 3 years, seen that expression on him. Not calculated. Not composed. Not the face of the man who ruled Seoul. Terrified. Stay awake, he said. His hand around my face. His voice was shaking. Amara. Stay awake. Please. Please. I had never heard him say please like that. Not in a negotiation. Not in a private moment. Not ever. The world was narrowing at the edges, but I could see his hands. Those precise, controlled hands that had run empires and ended threats. Shaking. Blood on his knuckles from where he'd pulled debris off me. I'm awake, I said. Or I tried to. I think I heard him exhale. And then, everything went very far away. What I understood, later, when I had time to put it together, he had not once, in the chaos of that attack, prioritized himself. Not the operation. Not the men. Not the negotiation that had been the entire reason we were in that room. Just me. He would have burned Seoul alive to keep me breathing. And that terrified me more than the attack. Because love that large does not protect you. It makes you a weapon that can be used against the person holding it. The hospital was quiet. I woke slowly, in the specific way that medication makes you surface through fog. White ceiling. Monitors. My left arm bandaged from the wrist to the elbow. 2 men in the room. Daniel was on the far side, sitting straight in a chair near the window, his hands folded, his face arranged in the careful expression of someone who had arrived and didn't know if they had the right to be there. Jae-won was beside the bed, asleep in the chair, the same posture as Lagos, one arm across his chest, his face finally still. He hadn't changed his clothes. There was still blood on his sleeve that no one had made him change out of. He had not left. When Daniel saw I was awake, he stood slowly and came to the bedside. He didn't touch me. He just looked at me with that calm, steady attention he always carried. You deserve peace, he said quietly. Simple. Not a sales pitch. Just a truth he wanted me to have. Jae-won woke at the sound of Daniel's voice. The 2 men looked at each other across the bed. Something passed between them. Not hostility. Something more complicated than that. The acknowledgement of 2 people who understood exactly what was at stake and had the maturity, barely, to not make this moment about them. Jae-won said nothing. Because he was, for the first time in his life, genuinely unsure of what he deserved to ask for. I looked at Daniel first. This good, calm, capable man who had offered me something I would have dreamed of at 24. Then I looked at Jae-won, rumpled and sleepless and still here. This impossible, complicated man who had broken something between us and then flown 11 hours to earn the right to try to repair it. I took a slow breath. Peace was never what I wanted, I said. Daniel nodded once. Not wounded, understanding. He had always been too intelligent to be surprised by the truth. I reached out and found Jae-won's hand. He went completely still. Then I said, and I meant every word of it, but neither is becoming weak for love. I looked at Jae-won directly. What happened in that room happened because someone told them where we would be. Someone at your table. And before we do anything else, before you hold my hand, before we decide what we are to each other, I need you to understand that I already know who it is. He straightened. Then we deal with it, he said. Together, I said. As equals. Or not at all. Together, he said. No hesitation this time. 3 days after I was discharged, I called a strategy meeting. Not Jae-won's usual format. His inner circle around that long table. Everyone performing loyalty. My format. Smaller. Quieter. And with one critical difference. I had placed specific and slightly different versions of the same false intelligence with 7 people over the previous 2 weeks. The version that had leaked to the attackers had contained one detail that only one person had received. I walked into the room. Everyone stood, including Jae-won, which still landed in my chest differently than I wanted it to. I placed a file on the table. Jae-won looked at me carefully. Who is it? I looked around the table slowly. Let the silence sit. Then I said, the person trying to destroy us has been sitting at this table from the beginning. I opened the file and slid it to the center of the table. The name inside was not Lieutenant Beck, the man everyone had assumed it would be, the obvious suspect, the one who had never hidden his resentment. It was Kim Juno, Jae-won's chief financial architect, his longest-standing confidant, the man who had been at his side for 11 years and had helped build the entire financial backbone of the empire. The man who, I had discovered, had been quietly redirecting funds toward a rival network for 14 months. Not out of ideology, not out of vengeance, out of fear. Fear that when I returned, when Jae-won restructured power around me, there would no longer be room at the table for a man whose only real value had been being the one person the boss trusted absolutely. He had tried to remove me because he understood what I represented. Not a threat to the empire, a replacement for his irreplaceability. The room was very still. Kim Juno looked at the file. Then he looked at me. And in his expression, I saw the thing I had seen in every man who had ever underestimated me. The moment they realized they should have been afraid from the beginning. The first time I loved Kwon Jae-won, I disappeared inside his empire. The second time, I became dangerous enough to stand beside him. But loving a powerful man teaches you one final lesson. The closer you stand to power, the harder it becomes to tell who's protecting you and who's waiting to betray you. And that is part 2. Amara is not to be played with. If this story had you feeling things like genuinely on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this with someone who needs a good story today. Subscribe because something you won't be expecting will be coming out on this channel, and you do not want to miss it. And a comment I need from you right now. Did you see Kim Juno coming? And what do you think Jae-won does next? Drop it below. I read every single one and I reply. See you in the next story.